The Center for Children's Health, led by Cook Children's, is grateful that you are taking the time to learn more about this devastating issue of child abuse and neglect. Preventing child abuse and neglect requires the community's involvement. As community members, neighbors, and peers, we must all do our part to make sure children are safe and cared for. If you suspect child abuse or neglect, it is your responsibility to report it, even if you are not 100% certain. Rest assured, trained professionals will evaluate the situation and determine what is needed. We understand that for a parent, the thought of encountering Child Protective Services is terrifying. The process can feel shameful and invasive. Please know that Cook Children's and CPS wants to make sure that families have the resources and support they need to take care of their children. Thank you for taking the time today to learn more about how you can support our community.
My name is Robin Chavez, and I am the CPS Liaison at Cook Children's Medical Center. Today, I'm going to be talking about child protective investigations, what you can expect with CPS, just kind of defining some of the things that people typically have questions about what we do, and kind of hopefully helping explain the process a little bit more. So I work for Child Protective Investigations. That is comprised of statewide intake, which is where you call to make a report of child abuse or neglect or adult abuse or neglect. We have investigations, which includes traditional investigations and alternative response. Alternative response is just a different way of doing things. So alternative response has typically about 120 hours to make contact with the family. They're more of a collaborative approach. So they will call or text the family before they just show up. Whereas in traditional investigations, we typically just kind of show up unannounced is how we like to do it. But with alternative response, their goal is kind of a more family-centered, families can make their own decisions and families know what's best for them. So they're usually the less severe cases that come in, and there have to be children that are, I think, over the age of 5 in order for it to qualify. So there can't be any victim children that are younger than that. But it's really just a way to bring the family together, talk with the family and their support system about what's going on, what the concerns are, and see if we can find a solution. Those cases do not have a disposition typically unless there was some reason during the middle of that case that they felt like they needed to progress it to a regular investigation. So when those cases are closed, those families typically don't have a disposition, which means they're not on the child abuse registry, and it's not going to preclude them from things like going on field trips with their kids or adopting children in the future. We also have the Special Investigations Division, which we call an SI. Special investigators are usually, they're always former law enforcement. So their job is just kind of to assist the investigators in doing things like if we're having trouble locating a family or a parent, they can help us do that. They have access to different systems that we don't have access to, and they can kind of run different searches and help us find those people. They also help go with us on serious cases. So any cases that are going to be like serious physical abuse or child deaths, they typically accompany us on those cases just because they have experience with law enforcement and kind of can help guide us when we need it. It is a little bit intimidating, so it is very helpful to have them there. We also have Child Protective Services, which is what most people know us by. That Child Protective Services is comprised of family-based safety services, which we shorten to FBSS, and conservatorship, which we a lot of times shorten to CVS. So family-based safety services is a voluntary short-term involvement, and generally there's no legal involvement, so we haven't taken custody of the kids. This is typically our first step when we suspect that the family needs a little bit more help or resources. So we try to do family-based safety services before we go straight to taking custody or taking legal action. Obviously, if it's a super serious or severe case, that would not be an option, but that's, for the most part, what we try to do is have families work services first with FBSS. FBSS will typically work with families in the home. Usually the children are still there. There are times where the children might be placed in a voluntary placement that we call a parental child safety placement, or a PCSP. And that's just where we've asked the caregiver or the parent if there is a person that they would be okay with and that would be willing to care for their children while we kind of work on some things with them. Those people do have to pass background checks. So they would have to pass a CPS check for their background as well as criminal, and they couldn't have anything, serious, like usually violent offenses or murders or drug offenses, stuff like that. We kind of take it on a case-by-case basis, but for the most part, they have to have a pretty clean background to be able to do that. For conservatorship, that's more long-term involvement. Those cases last anywhere from 12 to 18 months. So when we do intervene legally and take custody of a child, the parents will have at least 12 months to work to try to get their child placed back in the home with them. It can be extended for 18 months if there is a legitimate reason for an extension and the judge has approved it. So typically just 12 to 18 months for them working to get their children back. They will get an option to work to get their children back every time we take custody, even if it's not the first time. Unless there was maybe a previous termination and there were certain grounds met for that termination. But for the most part, they do get a chance to work every time to get their children back. And every case, for the most part, would start out with the goal being family reunification. So we would make it our goal to try and have those parents work services so they could hopefully mitigate any risk or concerns that we had to get their children placed back in the home with them. The CPS vision is improving the lives of those we serve. So the responsibilities of CPI are to conduct civil investigations of reported child abuse and neglect. We protect children from abuse and neglect. We promote the safety, integrity, and stability of families, and we provide permanent placements for children who cannot safely remain with their own families. What is child abuse and neglect? Child abuse and neglect involves specific acts or omissions by a person responsible for a child's care, custody, or welfare, and or refusal to accept parental responsibility. So there are various types of abuse and neglect that we investigate. The different types of abuse would be emotional abuse, labor trafficking, physical abuse, sex trafficking, sexual abuse, and forced or coerced marriage. The different types of neglect would be abandonment, medical neglect, neglectful supervision, physical neglect, and refusal to accept parental responsibility. So statewide intake receives the telephone calls or the various reports of abuse or neglect. Those can be the telephone calls, it can be an internet report, it can be a written report or a walk-in report. We've had reports faxed in, mailed in, it just depends. So once they get that information, they review it to make sure it meets the criteria to be sent to the field for investigation. It can be sent straight to the field, or it will sometimes go to a screener. If it goes to a screener, those are usually the less serious cases. So anything that would be considered a priority 1 or an immediate call out would not go to a screener. But if it was a priority 2, it could then go to the screener if there were children above the age of 3 in the home. So they would then make phone calls, try to contact the reporter, try to contact various other agencies, maybe the school, daycare, whoever they can, to try and get more information to determine if that report meets the criteria to be investigated. And if so, they can either send it for traditional investigation or alternative response. But once statewide intake determines that it will go to one of these places, they either assign it as a priority 1, which means immediate call out. We do have 24 hours to respond to priority 1. However, most of the time we do try to get out on those immediately unless there is a reason that we need to wait. For instance, if the child attends school and we feel like they would be safe for one more night until we can meet them at school the next day because maybe it's after hours, we would do that. Sometimes we do want to interview those kids away from the home, just because if you're interviewing them at the home or anywhere where the perpetrator may have direct access to them, they might be less likely to make an outcry or tell the worker if something's wrong. We also have priority 2 investigations, which we have 72 hours to respond. So we have about 3 days to respond to those. And then we have priority none. Priority none means that we took the report, but we didn't feel like it met the criteria for abuse or neglect. So it just kind of gets shut down at the statewide intake level and never really gets sent to the field. They will also forward these reports to the appropriate region and office. Typically, they will send the report to the county where the managing conservator lives. So if mom and dad are divorced and mom lives in one county and dad lives in another county and mom has primary custody of the children, it would go to the county that mom was in. There are some exceptions. So if the child is maybe further away than the county that the conservator lives in and those people can't get there quickly, it would go to wherever the child was at, but then it would end up being transferred to the county where the managing conservator lives. Persons required to report. Any person that has cause to believe abuse or neglect occurred is required to report. Texas, everybody is a mandated reporter, so that's important to understand. Professionals are also mandated to report, and they do have to make their report within 48 hours of learning of the abuse or neglect. It's important to understand that a professional cannot delegate or rely on another person to make the report. If you do that, you would run the risk of maybe getting some criminal charges or losing your license or something like that. It's not something that happens frequently, but if there was a situation that was severe enough, law enforcement or somebody else could decide to take that further, and you could possibly get charges for failure to report. So you definitely want to make sure that you're covered and that you're making your reports yourself. So that way there is a record that you did make the report if it were to ever come back up again. So when you should call and report to CPS, obviously, if you have an outcry of abuse or neglect from a child, if you see observable evidence of abuse or neglect, so these would be things like marks, bruises, maybe if you see a child with like a broken limb or something that is very clearly wrong, there's an obvious defect or deformity that could have been caused by abuse and neglect, you should definitely call that in. Scars, things like that. Domestic violence where the child is injured or at risk of injury. If there was a DWI or DUI with a child in the vehicle, or if there is a drug endangered child. So a drug endangered child is just going to be someone who maybe you suspect the parents are using some sort of substance and the child either has access to that or is being exposed to that or could be put at risk of harm or endangerment based on the parent's behavior while they're under the influence. Other things that you can report are unsanitary living conditions. It's important to understand that this needs to be a true health or safety hazard. Sometimes it's hard because families don't meet criteria or they don't live in a way that maybe you or I would live, but it's important to understand that if it's not a true health or safety hazard, there's really not a lot we can do about it. One of the things to keep in mind is that we cannot intervene based on poverty alone. We do have to have some sort of instance of abuse or neglect to be able to have a report and do something about it. So it is important as community members that we start helping those families and making those referrals to community services that can help them. Sometimes, you know, a CPS report isn't really going to help a family, but if you were to give them resources or try to help solve the situation yourself, if it's not abuse or neglect, that would be the most help to the family. Another thing that you can call and report is if basic needs aren't being met. This would be food, shelter, or water. Again, this does not have to meet your personal standards. So for CPS, if you call in a case because a family maybe doesn't have running water, but they're living next to maybe a grandparent or another relative, and they have running water at their house, and the family is compensating by going to get the running water or taking showers over at the relative's house, that would not be a reason to call in a CPS case. So it would truly need to be, they do not have these items and there's no compensation being made for them to get these items or work around that. A report should reflect the reporter's belief that a child has been or may be abused or neglected or has died of abuse or neglect. So I have some examples in here of a dirty house. This would be physical neglect. You can see that the top one is kind of just a messy kitchen. There's dishes everywhere, but it's not, it may not be clean, but it wouldn't be a health or a safety hazard to a child. And then in the picture below, you can see that there is just stuff piled everywhere. There's really no room to walk or move around, and that could present a problem. So if there were a fire or some emergent situation where they needed to get out quickly, it would probably be difficult to do that. That would obviously be a safety hazard. If there's a chance that maybe some of the piles of debris could fall on the child or harm the child, that would be something else. So before you pick up the phone, here are some important things that you should have ready. You want to know who. You want to provide as much identifying information about the person as possible. It is helpful for us to have first and last names, date of birth, address, telephone numbers, and information for any household members that may be living in that house, if it's possible. Understand that we do have ways to kind of find information on people, but when we have to do that, it does slow down the process and it does take us longer to get to those families because we have to find this information first. So if you have that information, it is extremely important that you have it ready when you're making the report, so that way you can provide all of that information to the intake worker. We need to know what happened. So you need to provide the details of what happened, who it happened to, who the perpetrator is or the person suspected of causing the abuse or neglect. And if you know anybody else that was present, those are details that we need too. We need to know where. We need to know where the family lives. We need to also know where the abuse or neglect occurred. This is important because sometimes if it's a criminal case and we're having to work jointly with law enforcement, they need to know where the abuse or neglect occurred, because that's going to determine which law enforcement agency has jurisdiction. And we want to make sure that we get it to the right agency first so it doesn't prolong or delay things. We need to know when. We need to know if this was a one-time incident, if it's something that's continuing to occur, when the child was abused, if you know that. These are all important things for us to know. And we also need to know locating information for any person, regardless of their role, professional or family member, if they have any information that could assist with the investigation. So sometimes they will ask for what is called collaterals when you call. That's just somebody else that may have information regarding the abuse or neglect. So if you're a teacher and the child has said something to you and maybe the counselor overheard it, it would be important to provide both people's information. Or maybe there was another family member that was present according to the child. That would be important information to have. Again, as much as you could provide. Names and phone numbers are fantastic, but anything you have, we will take. So some of the legal requirements for us to be able to remove children from the home: there has to be an immediate danger to physical health or safety, and or the victim of they're a victim of sexual abuse and they don't have a protective parent, or the caregiver is using a controlled substance and the use constitutes an immediate danger to the physical health and safety of the child, or the parent has allowed the child to remain in an environment where methamphetamine was being manufactured and reasonable efforts were made to prevent or eliminate the need for removal. It's important to understand that we are basically given our rules and our laws of what we have to follow from the lawmakers in Texas. So sometimes I know it can be frustrating when you feel like CPS isn't taking an action that you feel like they should take, but keep in mind we have a lot of of standards and a lot we have to meet and a lot we have to show that we've done first before we can remove a child. Basically, we need to have tried everything we can think of prior to removing a child, and we have to show the court that. It's also important to remember that removals are traumatic for children as well. So we have to weigh, would the trauma of removal be worse than the trauma of leaving them in this situation? So we take all of that into account. And like I said, we take into account age, vulnerability, all of that when we're looking at these things. Some of the things CPS does not do: we do not decide child custody. We can never give custody of a child to someone else. We can only take custody. So we can take custody and place a child with a relative or someone else, but we cannot give them custody. So sometimes we do get involved or get pulled into custody battles between parents. That's really not something we can do. We can investigate abuse or neglect to determine if the abuse or neglect has happened, but we really can't make a determination on who should have custody of that child. It's important to note that we also can't go against a court-ordered custody agreement. So if the parents already have a court order for custody, we would not be able to restrict another parent's access unless both parents agreed. We cannot stop or change child support payments. We cannot take sides in a divorce. We cannot enforce a court order, and we cannot enter a home without permission from an adult. So CPS makes all decisions based on child safety and what is believed to be in the child's best interest. When you make a report to CPS, it's important to understand that we keep reporter information confidential. So the only people that we will disclose this to are law enforcement, or sometimes we might have to disclose that to our attorney if we're taking custody of a child or we're going to court. We are never allowed to disclose the reporter's information unless we are court ordered to do so by a judge, and that is rare. So it's important to keep that in mind. Sometimes I used to tell people when they would call, understand I can't disclose the reporter's information. So if the family comes to you and tells you that I told them it was you that reported or starts asking you if reported, they're usually just trying to get you to admit. It's not that anyone has told them, it's that they sometimes just go around accusing people of reporting until somebody finally admits to it. So that's something to keep in mind. If you need to contact CPS to report abuse or neglect, the best way is to use the hotline. That phone number is 1-800-252-5400. It is open 24/7, even on holidays. You can call at any time to make a report. We do also have a website that you can report. It's going to be www.dfps, as in Department of Family and Protective Services, .state.tx.us. You can also call the local office. The number listed here is for the Cleburne office, but usually if you just use a search engine like Google and you Google the local CPS office, you can find the number. So the local office number that's listed here is for the Cleburne office or the Johnson County office, but you can use a search engine like Google or Bing to locate your local office if you need to. It's important to realize that if you're making a report, the best way is to call the hotline. I know it can be irritating because you get put on hold and you have to wait, but that is the fastest way for us to get a report. When you make a report online, it can sometimes get delayed and get held up for a couple of days. So if there's an urgent situation or something that we need to respond to right away, or you feel like there's something that really requires immediate attention, it's very important that you use the hotline number and you don't make the report on the internet, so that way we can get it and start processing it timely. That's everything that I have for this. If y'all have any questions, you can certainly reach out to your local office, or you can reach out to Cooks and they can get you in contact with me.